Okay, good morning. Welcome back to 23-1102. We can get right into our next panel from the Office of Consumer Counsel on depreciation. So Attorney Talbert Slagle, do you want to introduce your witness and I'll swear him in?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. Good morning, Mr. Dunkel. Could you please state your name and title for the record?
My name is William W. Dunkel, and I am.
Just make sure, is your microphone on?
My name is William W. Dunkel. I am a depreciation expert working with the OCC.
Thank you, Mr. Dunkel. If you could please raise your right hand.
Yes.
I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth under pains and penalties of perjury.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Dunkel, did you file initial testimony on February 8th, 2024, surrebuttal testimony on March 13th, 2024, and various interrogatory responses pertaining to the Connecticut Natural Gas Company in this proceeding?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections or amendments to any of those filings?
No.
Do you adopt those filings as your sworn testimony in this proceeding?
Yes.
With
that, the witness is available for cross-examination.
Thank you. Attorney Venora confirming that you waive. Thank you. Then Mr. Garrett, on behalf of authority staff, please.
Good morning, Mr. Dunkel.
Good morning again.
Could you turn to page 35 of your direct testimony?
Sure. Yes.
And there you're showing a table where CNG is proposing an increase of about $2.6 million in depreciation expense based on plant balances December 31st, 2022. Is that right?
That's correct.
And if your proposed rates were adopted, it would result in an annual depreciation accrual that is about $15.4 million less than what the company is proposing?
Less than the company, yes.
Okay. And is it fair to say that the differences between your proposed rates and the company's proposed rates are primarily due to differences in the net salvage rates you're proposing?
Yes, they have extremely high net salvage rates, and in fact, the highest in the country in some major categories, as we discussed yesterday.
And so not only are you proposing different net salvage rates, but you're also recommending a different method than Mr. Alice is when it comes to estimating net salvage?
Yes, he has in fact adopted a different method than this company adopted in the United Illuminating case and other cases. And his method, well, basically he wants to charge ratepayers around 7 times as much per year for net salvage as the company actually, the cost they actually incur. And to him, that sounds reasonable. As you know, I work in a lot of states, I work for staff or commissions, and we have to balance it, a balanced approach that balances the well-being or the interest of the investors versus ratepayers, and charging 7 times as much as the cost the company incurs is, to me, is not a reasonable balance. I recommend a more reasonable balance. And I'm talking the 2 major plants is what I just talked about, which are something like 70-something% of all investment, are the 2 major accounts in which they're trying to collect 7 times as much from the ratepayers as the cost they incur.
And so his method, he refers to as the traditional method. Is it based on your experiences, his approach uncommon?
The utilities love it. They often recommend it because it actually is there's 4 common net salvage methods, and it's the one that produces the highest rates for ratepayers. And so it's typically what the company witnesses sponsor or propose. And I don't blame them, but I'm not, I have to balance it. My job is, when you're working with staff, which is what we often do, is to establish a reasonable balance of the investors and the ratepayers' interests. Mr. Alice almost always works for the companies, utilities. And so he doesn't have that same requirement that we work with.
Do you recall some arguments made in Mr. Alice's testimony criticizing your approach that it might lead to higher costs for future customers?
Actually, he said that in one section. Another section, he said my method would result in collecting too much in the early years and less in the later years. That's a different section. So basically, he says many different things, whatever on that page he likes an argument to make. But yes, I do remember that was one argument he made, yes.
So is it correct that under your approach, you're looking at the past 5 years or so of the actual cost of removal and net salvage as part of your net salvage rate estimation?
All depreciation methods look at the past, including what he files. As a matter of fact, NARUC depreciation practices tells us to do that. Nobody knows what's going to happen in the future, but the way you try and make a reasonable estimate of what will happen in the future is you look at what has happened in the past, and then you make adjustments. Now, if something has changed, some laws changed or whatever, then you adjust for that. But if you ask how long will a set of poles live? Well, if you just sat there and didn't have any idea, you might say 10 years, 50 years, 100 years, I don't know. So what you do is you look at in the past for this company, and they keep records. They're required to keep very detailed records. And you look at that data and you say, well, the data says for this company, poles have been living on the average, and I'll make up a number, 60 years. Now, when you're projecting the future, you now know this. You know in the past for this company, they've been living 60 years average. So instead of saying, could be 10 years, could be 100 years, could be 1,000 years, you have to start off with saying, I know for this company in the past, they've lived 60 years. And so that's my starting point. Now, if something's happened, there's a new species of termites that can eat through the treatments or something, then you might adjust. But that's the starting point. And that's what I do in net salvage. I look at what they have spent. Well, that's actually called incur, which is very close to being what is spent. And I look at the last 5 years average. I look at the last 10 years average, and I look at all years I have. And that's my starting point. You could then assume that it would be the same in the future as has been in the past, but I don't make that assumption. State of New Jersey typically does. Instead of using any judgment, they say the last 5 years, it's averaged 2 million a year. We will assume it will be 2 million a year in the future. Then what they do is the next step is they come back, and the next case, they look backwards and they do an adjustment. They look at how much they collected for net salvage since the last case versus how much they actually incurred since the last case, and they'll do an adjustment. I prefer not to do that. I know from experience, if I look at what was spent in recent years, it will probably be higher in the future, just from experience, inflation, et cetera. So I don't set it equal to what the average expenditure has been in the past. I start with this as a known, and then I'm very generous above it, to be honest, but not 7 times. That's not being generous. That's being extreme.
And is that the factor that you're applying to the multiplier that you're applying to the historical net salvage costs? Is that what you're referring to when you?
I do not have a specific multiplier. I look at what is reasonable. I look at the 5-year average. I look at the 10-year average. And then I go well above either one of those, but not 7 times. Again, it's a reasonable judgment to charge ratepayers 7 times what is being, costs are being incurred is not, in my opinion anyway, a balance of the ratepayers and investors' interest.
So let's say if the company conducts another depreciation study in 5 years, and there's an abnormally large amount of retirements and net salvage in a particular account, is it possible that your method could result in higher net salvage rates than perhaps the traditional method would?
Like I say, I look at every year. If we have 15 years or 20 years of actual data, I look at every year. And I look for something abnormal, obviously. I mean, that's part of the judgment process. I formally calculate the 5-year average and the 10-year average. And I'm looking there. If I calculated a 5-year average and it was 2 million a year, they're actually incurring, but the 10-year average was 3 million a year, I wouldn't use 2 million as my starting point. I would say, something's happened in the last 5 years that's probably a little bit lower than normal. I would look then, all right, the average for the last 10 years was 3 million. I'm going to start thinking it from that point. Basically, it's whichever side, whichever number helps the company the most is where I start with. But then I go generously above that. It's just not 7 times that.
Is it your understanding that under both the traditional method and your method for net salvage that the company is going to recover all of its investment and cost of removal?
Ultimately, yes.
So it's just comes down to a difference of timing?
Yes, by charging 7 times what the company actually incurred, they would over collect from current ratepayers. And that's not appropriate.
So compared with the traditional method, and not to oversimplify it, but would you describe your method relatively as kind of more of a pay-as-you-go from a customer's standpoint?
No, it's reasonably looking at what the real costs are and allowing for the fact that they will be higher in the future. It is not basically speculation. What he does is, I call it the apples divided by oranges. He takes a dollar amount that's recent, like recorded in year 2022 dollars. Then he divides it by a dollar amount original cost that might have been recorded in year 1949 dollars. Now, the 1949 dollars is worth about 12 times as much as year 2022 dollars. So if you put a big number here because it's in current dollars, a little number here because it's in dollars from decades ago, you get a big percent. Now he says, oh, I got a big percent. That means I can charge ratepayers a lot. No, it means you divided a recent dollar amount by a dollar amount stated in dollars from decades ago. And that gives you a big percent, but it doesn't mean anything.
So if the company is still going to recover all of its costs under both methods, and
ultimately under the remaining life calculations, at some point you do recover everything unless somebody decides it was inappropriate expenditures or something like that. But assuming that everything you spent is considered to be reasonably spent, you will eventually get everything back. Yes.
So compared to the traditional, or compared to your method, do you feel like under the traditional method that current customers are prepaying too much in a way?
Absolutely. If your customers are paying 7 times what your company is actually cost they're actually incurring, that is way over too much, unreasonable.
So if costs continue to increase, net salvage costs overall in the future, for future customers, under your method, they would just pay the corresponding higher amount, whatever the cost the company incurs at the time?
Yeah, I mean, we do rate cases every, several years, not every year, but let's say every 5 years or so. So over the years, if something is going unusual that we didn't expect, adjustments would be made every rate case or every depreciation study anyway. But there's certainly nothing going on now that would justify charging ratepayers 7 times as much as the company's costs they're incurring. That's pure speculation to charge that much more.
Are you aware of other jurisdictions that have adopted a net salvage method that is different than the traditional method, or at least closer to the one that you're proposing here?
Sure, there's several. There's several within, 300 miles of here. Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey come to mind, Maine in some cases.
Are the similarities in those other jurisdictions related to that they're looking at recent net salvage costs as you are here?
There are several different methods. The key is they do not let Mr. Alice take a recent cost of removal stated in recent dollars and divide it by dollars of original cost that are stated in dollars from 1949. They say that produces a nonsense number. We're not doing that. So they pretty much all start with looking, what are the recent known incurred cost of removals for the last 5 years, last 3 years, last 10 years, et cetera. And that's their starting point, not divided by the original cost. They get rid of that, what I call the apples divided by oranges calculation, and starting with what is known as in recent actual incurred costs, they go from there. And that's the major difference.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dunkel. I have no further questions.
Okay.
Thank you. Attorney Inoue, Attorney Wright, EOE, Commissioner Karen.
Morning, Mr. Dunkel. Welcome back.
Hi.
You mentioned earlier that there are 4 different methods.
Yes.
Could you list them? Do you mind listing them? If you can.
Oh, sure. Matter of fact, in the United Illumination case, the company witness actually filed testimony and listed them.
Okay.
One is, well, what Mr. Alice uses, which, matter of fact, a Pennsylvania court called it replacement cost, future replacement cost is what they called his method. Another method is to look at the recent years of actual net salvage and go from there. And that's commonly used. Pennsylvania does that, Delaware does that, New Jersey does that. Maine does that in some cases. Another method is the method that's used for, primarily used for AROs, asset retirement obligations. And what those are future retirement costs, the same thing we're talking about here. The only difference is some future retirement costs, you don't know they will actually occur. For example, to the best of my knowledge, there's no law that says when a utility is done with a pole, they have to remove it. So it's theoretically possible if they had a pole out in the woods and nobody cared, they would just leave it there. I mean, that's possible. I'm not saying, they're planning to do, anybody's planning to do that. There's other future retirement costs where there is a law or rule or regulation that says when you're done with it, you have to do something certain with it. Nuclear power plants, the key example. If you own a nuclear power plant and you're done with it, you just can't walk away. You have to do certain things, are required by law. And if you're required by law to do these things, that's called an asset retirement obligation. The method they do there is they start with an estimate of what it would cost to retire it in today's dollars. They then say, well, we will inflate it. If we're going to retire it 20 years from now, because of inflation, if it costs $10 million today, it'll cost $20 million in future low value dollars because the dollars are worth less. Now, Mr. Alice likes that step, but The next step is they say we're going to take the present value of that cost. If it costs $20 million in today's dollars, it costs $10 million in today's dollars. It's going to cost $20 million in future dollars because they're worth less. But now we take the present value of that $20 million and say, what's the present value of that $20 million now? And it's not $20 million. $20 million in the future is not $20 million today. And it actually ends up less than where you started. So if you started at 10 million and inflated it to 20 million and take the present value, you might end up at 7 million. And that's where they start. And that's what's used for the AROs. You inflate it for future inflation, but then take the present value and you wind up back below where you started if you kept it in current dollars. And I'm not advocating that. But if you're going to do future inflation, which Mr. Alice likes, you have to also do present value, which brings you back to where or below where you started. FERC requires this method I just described, which includes present value. The FERC Uniform System of Accounts requires that for future retirements where there's a legal requirement that you actually have to do it, which are called AROs. So that's another method. I'm not sure what the fourth method was he discussed.
Okay, thank you. Concerning the traditional method, is that the oldest method, the first method used? It's just been constantly
Yeah, I can give you the history
versus
of it.
the newer methods.
Back, and this is actually the NARIC Public Utilities Depreciation Practices, which is the respected document in our business. It actually says that back in history, it was expected that the salvage value of something you retired would be greater than the labor cost, the cost to remove it. For example, if you retired a power plant way back when, which was full of copper and steel, that was valuable. Copper was very expensive, steel was very expensive, and the labor to retire the plant was, by comparison, less. So what happened in the past was whenever you retired something, you actually made net money. The company collected more money in salvage than they spent to retire it. There was a method developed back then, and NARIC says this. The purpose was to reduce the depreciation rate because there was residual value left in the plant. And they made a calculation that does that. It reduced the depreciation rate because you're going to collect money when you retire it, net. Over the years, labor costs and other things happened, and it switched. It got to the point where the labor was worth more than the copper, et cetera, that you would receive from retiring it. And that's called negative net salvage. The company, Mr. Alice, it turns out this works out very well for the utilities, and it's not really designed to properly collect money from the ratepayers, for future cost of removal. It wasn't designed for that, but they keep trying to apply it for something it wasn't designed for. And that's when other commissions, several of them, said it wasn't designed for that. We're not going to do this calculation anymore. We're going to do it properly. So we're going to design something that is intended to deal with future cost of removal. The ARO calculation was actually later developed by the regulators, specifically saying, we know the salvage is not going to pay for it. We know it's going to be a future net cost. How should we treat a future net cost? And the regulators, including FERC, said the way you treat a future net cost that you know is going to actually happen, you inflate it and you present value it, which took you back below where you would have been had you not done either one of them. I mean, that's what the regulators have said is the proper treatment, knowing that the salvage is not going to pay for the cost of removal.
Thanks, appreciate that.
Okay.
Let me just, because you said something like in the past it was developed because labor costs were significantly lower and the commodity prices of salvaged equipment was worth more. Would it make sense that a commission would, if commodity prices spiked, to be higher than the cost of labor at some point? would this method still be valid then? The traditional method, that is? In other words, is it based on the current economic environment one finds themselves in?
I don't think it's a temporary event. I think it's been pretty much over decades that the labor costs have gone up more than material prices have gone up or scrap prices have gone up.
Okay.
So I don't see that they're being, and plus you would make a uniform rule. You would say this is a valid method or not a valid method. I mean, all right, right now, vehicles is something they actually do. If you trade in a used truck, you get money for it and the cost of removal is very small. So vehicles are still positive net salvage, but that's like the exception to the rule. We don't make up, different rules. We just say, the vast majority of things, labor is more expensive than the scrap value. And so this is the rule will apply to everything.
And if you had to dismantle an automobile, then your labor costs would go up. Like literally like piece by piece.
If you
Yeah.
took it out piece by piece.
And then it would be
sure,
more expensive.
but as it is, you take it to the dealer and that takes you an hour and you get, $8,000 or whatever you get. Yeah.
Okay.
But that's one of the few exceptions. Almost everything else, the labor is higher than the scrap value.
Understood.
now.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Very quick question. Far be it for me to criticize NARUC. You're sitting up here with two former presidents, NARUC, but so you keep on referring to the NARUC 1996 manual.
Yes.
Do you think that should be updated? You think they were about I mean, it's 18 years old
Well,
and
to me, it's very useful. I mean, there's lots of history in there. You get to something, you say, well, why are they doing this? And they'll explain why they're doing this. They're explaining, it used to be that the scrap value was greater than the labor cost. I mean, that's why we made up this rule.
Right.
And it says in there, but it's not that way anymore. So that things have changed. Yeah. I don't know how you'd update it. I mean, if we made a committee and I was on it, Mr. Alice was on it, then that might be, there might be two sections, and that's, it's just not me. I mean, there's other people. You might have, the people from New Jersey and I and other people in Pennsylvania writing one section and Mr. Alice would be writing the other section. And I'm not sure what you would do with that.
okay, but as a guide now, you think it's still very valuable.
Yeah, it's very valuable. That's all.
Good. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I have no questions. Would you like a moment to consider redirect?
No, thank you, Chairman. We have no redirect.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dunkel. You're excused for now. If we could recall Mr. Alice for the SCG depreciation panel and leave authority staffer up first for cross-examination.
Chairman Gillette, while this panel's getting settled, we had one request with respect to a couple of the late filed exhibits and whether we could potentially adjust the filing deadline from the 13th to the 17th, and I can tell you which ones.
Can you tell me which ones? please?
Sure. The first one, it was late file 125 and the companion response was 137. This was on incentive goals. It's just taking some time to put that all together.
I'm sorry, you said to adjust it from the 13th.
13th to the 17th.
Okay.
And then the other one is the request on the unregistered meter reports, late file 146 and 165. If we could also request to move that. As
Okay,
well.
so the four were, you said 125 and 137.
Correct.
And then 146 and 165.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Apologies.
Well, we're trying to be consistent with the CNG start of this. So.
Morning. Set Church, what?
Good morning. Yes. So I'll remind the witnesses that they remain sworn. Attorney Vaughn, please.
To the panel members, do you recall answering a series of questions I asked you at the start of your testimony for CNG on the topic of depreciation?
Yes.
Yes.
You also recall answering questions on cross-examination from Pure Consultants in the OCC during that portion of the hearing.
Yes.
Yes.
In appearing now for SCG and for the purposes of administrative efficiency, do you adopt your testimony from the CNG transcript and stipulate that if asked those same questions again, your answers would be the same?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. The panel is available for cross-examination.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett, please.
Oh, that's not me.
I wish I could steal that script. I wanted to ask my questions just like that. Because I've been made aware there's an efficient way of dealing with the cross for SCG. And my questions are for you, Mr. Alice. You do propose different rates and accrual amounts for SCG than you did for CNG for the company's accounts.
Yes, that's right. There's a separate depreciation study for each company.
But other than those proposed depreciation rates and parameters for CNG's accounts compared with SCG's accounts, were there any material differences in your testimony or methods or approaches between the two companies?
I'd say in general, no, it was a similar approach and methods for the same companies, but obviously as with any depreciation study we do, we would look at anything specific to the two companies that might impact service lives or net salvage, including that they each have their own set of historical data to analyze.
Okay. And pertinently, with regard to your approach to the net salvage method, was that essentially the same for both companies?
It was. There are some things in the data that you would have to look at, obviously, when you're doing the analysis for each, but generally the method was the same and the approach was the same that I used for both.
Do you recall a few questions I asked you yesterday about site visits or your site visit for CNG specifically?
Yes.
Was your review, your field review of CNG's property conducted at the same time that you reviewed SCG's property?
Generally, yes. For, I guess, logistical efficiency, we did both site visits on the same trip and saw property for both companies on that trip.
Thank you, Mr. Alice. I have no further questions.
Thank you. Girl set for authority staff. I'll call it the Office of Consumer Counsel, please. Attorney Venora, while they're getting settled, I realized the 4 that you requested were from last week, which means they're already entered in Lotus. So I can't change the date in Lotus, but I will note for the record that the due date has been changed.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello again, Tom Wheel from the Office of Consumer Counsel. We are going to start with questions from Mr. Dunkel. I just wanted to raise, I've done my best as a non-depreciation person to assist Mr. Dunkel in streamlining his questions as we've been throughout the hearing, but if we of course, if there is a question where the response would be the same, just let us know, and it's not, wouldn't be on purpose, it would be duplicating questions.
Understand.
Okay. Hello, Mr. Ellis. I'm William Dunkel. I'm an expert on depreciation working with the OCC. And do we have slides? Yes, we do. Okay. I show you your response to OCC 053. And I think we talked about this yesterday. And I believe yesterday we agreed that the highest in account 360 services, negative 160 was the highest negative net salvage you or your firm had recommended for companies other than CNG or SCG. Is that still correct?
With the caveat you made at the end there, yes, but I would note that SCG has had actually even higher net salvage for this account in the past. It was 225%, I think, back in the 2007 study. So with the specific way you phrased that, yes, but for
Okay.
this company, there's been a history of having cost removal at least the level that I'm recommending.
Okay, I show you page 54 of your SCG depreciation study.
What page did you say?
Page 54. Is it correct that for accounts 380 services steel and account 380.1 services other, you recommend a negative 200% net salvage?
Yes, and I would note that for plastic, which is most of the services, it's a less negative estimate.
Okay. And so the negative 200% net salvage you recommend for these certain sub-accounts of 380 is higher than the negative 160 your firm has recommended for, which is the highest negative they have recommended for any of the other 80-some companies nationwide, as shown by that attachment 1, correct?
Yes, and that would be supported by both the historical data as well as the fact that this company has had estimates at least that high for, it looks like, at least the last 15 years.
And we're going to change subjects. I show you slide 5. Let's see what that is. I show you your response to OCC 402. You recall during the prior CNG panel, you were asked about at least 90% of mains and services being retired in place. Would your answers in this case be the same as they were as they were yesterday?
Yes, they would. And I think, if I remember correctly, my answer yesterday was that that's been the case historically. But I'd also, as I mentioned yesterday, in the future, if mains have to either be removed or if they're retirement-only projects rather than replacements, I would expect cost removal to increase quite a bit as a result of either of those factors.
Thank you. Now I show you your response to OCC 370. And in this response, you say the portion in column E would be the portion of the SCG's proposal associated with net salvage. And I show you the second page of that. On the line that is called account.
Sorry,
37
we were in OCC 370 and now we're,
Should
I didn't
be.
mean to interrupt.
You're fine.
We had the same question yesterday. The situation here was that this attachment was part of the question that was posed in the interrogatory response. The question was referencing this attachment. I just don't think that the attachment itself was provided in the response to OCC.
And this that's on the screen right now is something that's attached to Mr. Dunkel's testimony, but is
Correct.
you're representing as the same attachment that was an attachment to the question itself.
Yes. Is it correct that under your proposal for mains plastic, the annual amount for net salvage would be 5.4 million to round off the number?
Yes, it is. And there's actually something I thought of it that I should clarify on this yesterday. So this is the way you would split the remaining life depreciation rates into a part for original cost and net salvage and calculate what the inherent net salvage accrual is within those rates. But because this is based on the remaining life technique, I don't know that this is really the right numbers that you'd use to compare, like Mr. Dunkel tries to do, to historical recorded costs, because the remaining life technique automatically kind of incorporates any past under or over recovery. So there's kind of a mix of stuff in there with that. So I agree with the numbers with the way they're calculated, but I'd add that caveat, particularly when using it for what's kind of an untested and made up method that he's proposing here.
Well, if it's not 5.4 million in your proposal, which is for net salvage, how much is it? What's your preferred number?
I don't know. I haven't gone through and done a
Okay.
calculation based on that. I would think that that would be something you would look at with your method.
Now, isn't it correct for this account, you're proposing a negative 180 net salvage?
No.
No? Okay, I'll withdraw that question. Now, under in your response to this request, to what you agreed was a correct number, the 5.4 million was for mains plastic. For mains other is the dollar amount for net salvage under your proposal, and I'll round it 1.4 million.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I wasn't following.
Sure. On the line that's called mains other is the amount in column E, which is the amount under your proposal for net salvage, approximately 1.4 million.
Yes.
So under your proposal for the mains category, including all sub-accounts, approximately 6.9 million per year would be collected for net salvage under your proposal. Is that correct?
Say the number again.
6.9 million, the sum of those two.
Yeah, that sounds in the ballpark.
Okay. I show you page 126 of your SCG depreciation study. And on the last page, the bottom line in the column that's entitled net salvage amount, is it correct that the average net salvage cost your company has incurred, and not your consulting firm, but SCG has incurred per year averages 1,003,000, and that's over the last 5 years?
Can we go to the previous page?
So, I'm sorry?
Can we go to the previous page?
Sure.
So I think, yeah, right there. So yes, you're correct with that number, but if you look at 2021 and 2022, I think there's a timing difference in the data here that retirements and cost removal that happened in 2021 and 2022 were recorded in either 2023 or later. So that 5-year average you cited is correct from these work papers, but it's not really the last 5 years of what's being spent. So I think that that's particularly for this account and for this company, another real challenge with his method, because he's using a 5-year average that really isn't an indicative 5-year average of what's been being recorded.
Okay, what is the five-year average for the net salvage amounts shown there? What's the average for the last 5 years?
Well, that would be the number, the roughly 1 million that's on the next page, but it's really 3 years worth divided by 5. So it's not really a true 5-year average when I look at that data.
All right, well, let's go back up, go up a little bit more, go to earlier pages. Okay, right there. What is the highest year? Well, let's look at this page. Highest year I see on this year is 2.4 million. Let's go back to earlier.
2.5 million.
2.5 million, okay. Let's go back earlier. Go back one page early. Okay. Do you, and I see I don't even see a million. Go down a little bit. I don't see a million so far. Go down a little bit. I see one number that's 1.6 million. So is it correct the highest year that the company has incurred for net salvages in this account is 2.4 million, and that's an exception, that most of the years are way below 2.4 million, correct?
No, I wouldn't agree.
Or 2.5 million?
No, I wouldn't agree with what you just said there. I wouldn't agree that the 2.5 is an exception. You can see that the cost removal has already started to go up starting in 2016. So I would say that probably the years before that seem a little bit anomalous. I also, as I talked about quite a bit yesterday, I think those numbers are going to go up quite a bit in the next 10, 20 years, things like that. So I would pretty strongly disagree with the characterization of 2020 as being an exception there.
Okay, Mr. Alice, didn't you prepare this document and didn't you get these net salvage amounts from the company's books and records?
Yes, and I prepared this to do the traditional net salvage analysis that's used in at least 46 states across the country, and contrary to what was said earlier, has been affirmed and accepted by FERC on more than one occasion. So this analysis, this data is prepared for that analysis, and I've considered that and taken all this into account when I've done my analysis. If you're going to do a different type of analysis that you're just basing on recent expenses like Mr. Dunkel's doing, you need to look at this a lot harder and make sure that your numbers are correct.
Okay, does the company, you said these net salvage dollar amounts you prepared based upon your theory. Does the company have two sets of books? If I asked the company and went to the company's books and say, how much did you incur in the year 2019 for net salvage in account 376.1 mains other, are there two different numbers? Did they incur 1.37 million, or is there another set of books that says 5 million, for example?
So I'm not really sure I understand your question there.
Your question,
It's the same data, but if you have to think about how you're analyzing it. If you're doing an analysis that's comparing net salvage to retirements as a ratio, if you have a year or two where there's a timing difference in the data or things like that, you can handle that by looking at longer term averages, things like that, because you're comparing cost removal to retirements. If you're doing something that you're really anchoring, and again, you shouldn't do this because it doesn't make sense mathematically, but Mr. Dunkel's method, if you're doing something where you're anchoring to just what's been spent, you need to look closely and see whether what's been spent is really kind of reflective of normal operating conditions, or if there's something like a timing difference or things like that in the data. I think what you'll see is that in 2023 and 2024, there's a lot more cost removal because there was just timing and when that was recorded. So the data is the same, but the way you analyze it matters. It's important, and you need to be able to understand what you're seeing in the data when you do that analysis. And for a whole myriad of reasons that I've talked about in my testimony extensively, the analysis I've done, which is again supported by NARIC, it's used in almost every state. It's what almost everybody does. Works well with this data set, with the way it's constructed and how it's put together. What he's doing does not, particularly because of what we see in the last couple of years here.
So is your answer, there's really only one set of books that the company keeps, and if that set of books says for a certain year they incurred $1.7 million, that's what they incurred? Or are you saying there's a different number that we should say they incurred for the year 2019, for example?
I'm agreeing with you that there's one set of books,
Okay,
but you
thank
have
you.
to do the analysis correctly. And if you're using an incorrect analysis and not doing the analysis correctly, you're not going to get the correct results.
All right. To summarize it, I believe we have at the bottom of this. All right, let's go on. I now go to page 126 of your depreciation study. All right, let's go. Let's summarize where we're at. On page 126, the average for mains plastic was 1 million and 1.0 million. Is that correct for the 5-year average? Go back up a little bit. Go back to page 126.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, there you go. That was for mains plastic, correct?
I don't think so. Could you kind of go to what page you want to talk to? Because you're saying numbers that are different than I'm seeing there and are different from what I'm seeing here.
Okay. Roll up so they can see the page number on that. Okay, sorry about that. Let's see. On page 126 of your depreciation study, does it show the 5-year average net salvage amount is 1,003,284?
Yes, that would be for account 376.1 mains other.
Mains other,
And of
all right?
course, so you need to keep in mind some of the considerations we talked about earlier.
Okay, now we're going to look at the other big sub account, mains plastic. Which is page 129 of your depreciation study. Is the average, according to the company's books and records, average net salvage incurred over the last 5 years, average 840,000, 444.
Yes.
Okay. Now, if we add these two numbers for two different sub-accounts and mains together, one of which was roughly 1 million, which was roughly 800,000 or so, is the total net salvage cost incurred by the company in the mains account, including all sub-accounts, in the last 5 years, average approximately 1.8 million per year.
A little bit more than that, but it would round to 1.8 million.
Okay. And by comparison, you propose to collect from ratepayers 6.9 million a year for net salvage in the mains account, correct?
Based on the calculations you showed earlier, yes. And as I said yesterday, that's appropriate. And it occurred to me too, talking about the gas industry and units of production and things like that. I don't see any possible way that what I've recommended is too high in this case. I'm pretty confident that depreciation is going to need to go up. And like I showed with those units of production calculations, probably quite a bit. I think the idea of reducing depreciation a lot in this case, given the context, strikes me as not the right approach. And also in a lot of ways, I think contrary to the state's climate goals, there's going to need to be a lot of cost spent. There's a lot of changes coming and things like that. And changing to use a method that nobody else really uses to reduce net salvage strikes me as a really poor way to approach things when, as I've said, I think these costs are going to go up as we go through this energy transition.
Let's go now to slide 9, which is page 20 of your rebuttal testimony. Starting on line 3, you state, in my experience, removal costs in more densely populated areas closer to major metropolitan areas on the east or west coast tend to have higher removal costs than other parts of the country. And importantly, the company's net salvage data supports that it should have a higher removal cost than most other utilities. Now let's talk about the company's net salvage data that you referred to in this statement. Go back to slide number 8, which is page 126 of your depreciation study. And this is this the company's net salvage data that shows for this sub-account of mains, the net salvage cost incurred was 1,003,284 for one of the major sub-accounts, correct?
I mean, this is the same number we've looked at like
Yes.
5 times, so yes.
Yes. And is it correct that SCG was an East Coast company during the years that are included in that average?
Yes, and like I talk about in the next paragraph of my rebuttal testimony there too, there's been relatively high cost removal and net salvage estimates that Pure has approved for at least the last 15 years. So that would be consistent with what I've seen as far as where removal costs tend to be higher on the east and west coast than say in the middle part of the country.
But even though it's East Coast, the recorded number is 1 million something, and then we looked at another 800,000 for another sub-account. That's being an East Coast company, right?
And the percentages are higher than you see in a lot of the other ones. So the cost removal is higher than I would see in non-East Coast companies and things like that.
Okay. Let's go on to OCC 381. I'm sorry, OCC 681. In response to Part B, you say the net salvage costs are equal to the original cost multiplied by the net salvage percent.
Was that a question?
Yes. Is that what you say?
Yes.
Okay. To understand how you do this, is it correct that if SCG retires in place a service line which had a $2,000 original cost, and you have proposed a negative 200% net salvage for that account, you would multiply the 2,000 original cost times 200% and get 400,000 as the claimed net salvage cost to retire that service in place, correct?
Yes, based on the company's historical data, that's what you'd expect to see for that. As I talked about yesterday, this question is referring to figure 5 of my testimony, which kind of shows the net salvage costs are going to go up, looking a little bit like a bell curve. That's under kind of normal operating conditions. I actually think with gas energy transition stuff and things like that, you're going to see that curve peak a lot sooner, both because there's the potential for more retirements, but also because, as I talked about yesterday, removal costs are going to be higher for retirement-only projects than for replacement projects. So I've applied this technique to calculate the cost removal and what I'm kind of forecasting in that illustrative figure to show what's going to happen. But I actually think it's going to be a lot more pronounced and a lot higher given what's going to happen in the state and in New England.
Let's ask a slightly different question. We've agreed if the original cost was 2,000, you would say 4,000 would be the cost of removal. What if the original cost was $200? Would you then multiply that by the negative 200% and say the cost of removal would be $400?
Yes, and this is based on an average, I mean, a whole bunch of different units for the whole system. So those are average costs, but yes, that's how the math would work.
Okay. We're going to go to page 9 of your testimony,
Rebuttal or direct?
of your direct testimony. And do you recall on the panel yesterday, you were asked about whether you had proposed units of production depreciation for any electric utility? Would your answers be the same if asked today in this panel?
Yes.
Please look at page 5 of your rebuttal. I've been asked to say, there was a whole series of questions yesterday that followed this. Would your answers be significantly different, although the dollar amounts might be somewhat different?
No, I would answer a
Okay.
similar way.
And just for the record, so that question was regarding a line of questioning pertaining to the 2050 outlook. So those, just to confirm, those responses would be conceptually the same other than dollar amounts.
Right, yes.
Thank you.
I could find it if you would like me to, but is it correct that as you had done in your CNG testimony, in your SCG testimony, you also mentioned the possibility of the number of customers declining in the future?
Yes, and I
Okay,
remember correctly, Dr. Hopkins suggested that that could be a possibility as well.
and that's mentioned in your testimony. All right. Is the number of SCG customers actually declining right now?
You mean at this second?
Actual data that we have up to this point.
I believe the rates panel sponsored a data request on that.
It's also a different question than my testimony, which is about the future, not what's happened over the past, say, 20 years or so. I'm not sure the point of the question.
Let's look at slide 16, which is the company response to OCC 378. And in this request, we asked for the number of service lines in service and the number of customers for several past years. Looking at the last page of this response, is it correct that the number of SCG customers is not declining?
I think the way you're saying is not declining is you're looking at numbers in the past. In the past, the number of customers have grown. That's one reason why you should expect that depreciation for net salvage should be higher than what's spent in the past, because there's going to be more things to retire in the future. That along with kind of the mortality characteristics of the property. But my testimony, I'm not sure why you're pulling this up with regard to my testimony. My testimony is about what might happen in the future. And again, it was something that I think Dr. Hopkins raised as well. You know, I know he also mentioned something to the effect of maybe looking at a generic docket on gas issues or something like that. I've been involved in those in other states. You know, there's been work done on forecasting the future and things like that. And I think pretty much any of those forecasts I've seen expect a fairly material decline in both usage and potentially the number of customers. So my testimony is kind of talking about that future look, not what's in the past. But I will add that the fact that the number of customers grown in the past supports my method for net salvage as well, which again, If we do see declines in customers, declines in throughputs and things like that, there's no way what I've proposed is too high of depreciation. It's quite a bit too low. I think order of magnitude of at least like half as much as it probably ends up needing to be if that's really what the future looks like. So I wouldn't want to be significantly reducing depreciation expense in this case.
Do you remember yesterday you were asked some questions pertaining to when the standard or the goal of reducing emission levels by 80% by the year 2050, when that goal was established by the legislature? Do you remember those questions?
I do remember those questions.
Have you done any research on that?
Yeah, I went back and looked. We had actually researched that when we were working on the case, and I couldn't remember the exact years. Kind of funny, I actually testified in 2 jurisdictions yesterday, and I got asked about the years of greenhouse gas laws in both jurisdictions, and I couldn't quite remember the dates, but 2008, I believe, is when.
2008, okay. Thank you. Now, as far as for purposes of the CNG case, is that number also 2008?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Next, we just have some questions from Mr. Apollonia, and then we will be done.
Hi, I'm Rory Apollonia. I'm a accounts examiner at OCC. I just have a couple questions, so hopefully it'll go fast. So I'm going to start off with OCC 53 interrogatory response attachment 1.
That's the one we looked at earlier with the like list of estimates for.
I believe it's different. I didn't bring this one up yesterday.
Sorry, with Mr. Dunkel.
Yeah, sorry. It's the same one I think that Mr. Dunkel asked me about
Okay,
earlier.
gotcha. So my question for this one is, can you, like, what company is company number 1?
So we list the companies separately, but for various reasons associated with our work product and stuff like that, aren't able to identify which is which. I mean, the studies are publicly filed in my CV. I list cases and things like that, but I don't have that.
Okay, so you wouldn't be able, because of confidential reasons, like indicate the companies, which I see there's a company tab with all the companies there, and then a corresponding industry stats tab with like company number 1. It goes down to like, I think 30.
83, I think.
Okay, a lot more. So you just can't provide that, like, confidentially?
Yeah, that's right. For confidentiality reasons, we can't do that. And I mean, I don't use it the way you're describing either. I look at kind of the overall range, but then really focus on studies I've done and things like that. And like I said, to the extent studies have been publicly filed, I've listed the cases and they'd be available on websites and things like that. But for, as you say, confidentiality reasons, can't kind of put those together.
Okay. So same exhibit, it doesn't contain the dates as to when the depreciation studies were performed. So my question is, how can a trend of increasing net salvage be confirmed if we don't know when the depreciation studies were performed?
Good. It's a good question. So this is just the most recent studies too. So we don't necessarily have something that we're tracking all the ones through that, but I mean, I can confirm it because I've probably worked on, I don't know, 200 or 300 depreciation studies in the last 17 years. And I can just, so I've looked at data sets for every single one of those and can see that. And again, those data sets, the net salvage analysis, like what I've shown here, is in, you know, filed in all of our studies across the country and things like that. So the data's out there and it's available. I mean, it's the experience of working on it and seeing all that numbers and things like that I'm basing those comments on. But it's very much what I've seen, and I don't think it's particularly controversial. I think most would agree that cost removal's gone up over the last 17 years of my career.
Okay, thank you for that. But is there a way you can get that into the record, like a late file? Get some support?
I'm not sure exactly what you're asking for. I mean, like for all, like the studies that are in my CV or something like that?
I'll just skip that for now. So I'm just gonna move forward. I'm gonna go to OCC 55, interrogatory response, attachment 1.
You said 55?
Correct?
Okay.
Okay, so does the Iowa 54 L1 curve more closely represent the data than the Iowa 50 L1 curve?
So no, I wouldn't agree with that. In part because it depends on what kind of specific data points you're looking at, but the 50 L1 matches the data through about age 30 more closely. And you kind of have this stair step thing after that that I wouldn't focus as much on. In part because of the age of the assets and things like that. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, particularly if you're looking at the data more closely and kind of interpreting those different data points and things like that.
So these data points that you're looking at more closely, like what exactly are they?
So I just want to get to the right page in the report and I can explain that.
Yeah, no problem.
So the data points are the data points from the original life table, and they're developed. We kind of walked through the survivor ratios, I think, a little bit yesterday, but they're developed by looking at plan exposed to retirement and the amount retired for each age and kind of the develop from that. And so page 57, I think, is the graph that's referenced in the data request response asked by this. If you look at the next page, it actually shows the whole original life table being developed. And what you'll see is that when you get out to older ages, particularly ages 30 and especially 40, the number of the dollar level of exposures decreases quite a bit. And I tend to give those data points less consideration when I do the curve fitting because it's a smaller sample size, it's older stuff, it may not be as representative of what's there today, that sort of thing. And so that's an important thing to remember when looking at these graphs, because again, I think looking at this, the 50 L1 is, they're both somewhat similar fits in a sense, but the 50 L1 better captures the data through age 30 when there was a lot more investment available to study. And maybe less so for those older ages, but I wouldn't give those as much consideration. And that's why I wouldn't agree that the 54 L1 is necessarily the better fit there.
Okay.
Mr. Ellis is referring to Exhibit SCG NWA 2, SCG 2022 depreciation study, page 58.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
So I have 3 similar questions coming up. I'm gonna go to OCC 56, interrogatory response, attachment 1.
This one looks like a lot like the one we looked at yesterday.
Yeah, it's quite similar, but I think my questions are different, but if you think they're the same, just let me know. So my first question here is gas asset account 362 gas holders. It has 100% survival during the original life table. Why did you select an Iowa 90 L0 curve?
So this is actually, the reason is basically the same as yesterday. I have the same estimate for the same account for both companies. I just add to that there really isn't much data there. That 100% surviving at age 0 doesn't really tell you very much. And so for both companies, this account didn't have very much data. So we, again, look to what we've made estimates for similar assets for other utilities and similar types of facilities and that sort of thing.
Okay. Would your answer be the same for Iowa? Well, at gas asset account 363.3, and that one has an Iowa 40 L1 curve.
Generally, yes, although I think you would see that both companies have the same estimates for these as well. So in addition to, so I guess And I think there was more data for CNG. So in addition to looking at what we've done for other companies, that was obviously one of the considerations as well. And it made sense to have the same interim survivor curve estimates for both companies for these accounts.
Okay. And for gas asset account, looking at the same exhibit, 381.1 meters AMR. It has 100% survival during the original life table. You selected an Iowa 17 R3 curve. Would your response be the same?
Generally, in terms of things we would have considered, yes.
Okay. Am I correct to state that your judgment allows you to select a different Iowa curve, like that you selected here, the 90 L0, 40 L1, and a 17 R3?
You're asking whether my judgment is how I ended up with different estimates for those accounts?
Correct.
Yeah, and that's right. And obviously, part of that is looking at what the specific assets are in the account because they don't all have the same service lives.
Okay. And this judgment that you have, what is that based on?
Based on a lot. So my 17 years of experience, again, I've done hundreds of depreciation studies. I've met with subject matter experts from companies for pretty much just about every single one of those to discuss the assets and that sort of thing. I've done statistical analyses like I do in this case for each of those as well. So I kind of know what the data looks like for lots of companies and for things like that. And I go out and do site visits, both here and for all the other, pretty much all the other studies I've done as well. I've seen assets, gas assets all over the country and that sort of thing, in addition to meeting with people that are very knowledgeable about the assets. And I have colleagues that have a lot of experience as well. So I talk with them and with our team and things like that too, to make sure that we're kind of understand what everything is and are exercising the right judgment when making service life and net salvage estimates.
Okay, thank you for that. So you and your colleagues, would it be correct to say that the 1996 Public Utility Depreciation Practices Manual established by NARUC guides your judgment?
I certainly, I suppose effectively, yes, guides my judgment might is an interesting way of saying it. I certainly review and rely on concepts and things like that. It doesn't necessarily get into the details of specific accounts, but it does talk about general things that you should consider, including site visits and all that sort of stuff. So in that sense, yes, but it's obviously based on the specifics of the company and a lot of my experience as well.
Okay, would you say your overall experience in this field is guiding your judgment more than the NARUC manual?
Suppose you could say that. I would say that my experience and judgment definitely guides things within probably the framework and the methods and things like that that NARUC outlines.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to OCC 74 and interrogatory response attachment 1.
We're here.
Okay, so what is the difference between column F, which I believe is engineering and service, and column G, start month?
So these are fields in the company's fixed asset accounting system. The engineering and service year would generally be the vintage. There can be some reasons where there's slight timing difference between another field that's called in-service year and engineering and service year. The start month is the start month of, I think, when the activity was recording. So I think that aligns more with the transactional year when the activity occurred. So I think, for example, looking at, the second one there, I think that would be activity that happened in 2019 related to a vintage of 1999.
Okay, thank you for that. Can an asset ID be placed back in the service after the end month date occurs?
So, sorry, I don't understand. An asset ID?
Yeah, let me bring up this spreadsheet. So if you look at column A, it has an asset ID. I assume that is the plant. And I just want to know, after the end date occurs, can that plant come back into service?
I'm not quite, the asset ID, I think, is a number that points to the specific kind of transaction or maybe accounting record or something like that. I think the start and end date are, it sounds to me like you're asking a question of, once an asset is retired, can it be brought back into service?
Or are you asking about the asset IDs?
Well, this is the provided spreadsheet. I just want to know. So I'll re-ask my question.
Sure.
Yeah, or rephrase it. I'm not sure I'm understanding what you're asking.
Okay. My apologies. So I'm looking at this spreadsheet and I look at column A, I see an asset ID. And then I move over to, I believe it's column H, correct? It's the end month. So I just want to know if that, once it gets to the end month, what happens to that asset? Can it come back, or is it?
Yeah, I
completely
mean,
over?
so I think I can help then. So the end month is, I think, similar to the start month, referring to the accounting period or the transactional year. And the asset ID is, I think, associated with the asset or the record. So it depends on the type of activity. Like, there can be a retirement with an end month, or there could be an addition with an end month. And kind of depending on what's going on would affect that. I mean, I think what this is showing is retirements that happen in a given period of time. And so these specific retirements would be associated with that start month and end month.
Okay, thank you for that. That's all the questions I have.
I just have one follow-up just to understand that same spreadsheet. When you're referencing transaction timing, this might be a question for either of you. Is the distinction there something like the distinction between CapEx and plant entering service? Like, are the start dates based on expenditures rather than in-service dates?
Yes, correct.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome.
That's OCC's final question for this panel.
Attorney Wheel, did you want to replicate your late file for SCG?
Yes.
Okay. So that is 210. Provide excerpts from the NARIC manual relied on in Mr. Ellis's direct and rebuttal testimony.
And thank you. And as I've said to prior panels, I assume it'll be identical to the late file for the other company, but just for clarification, mostly for Mr. Ellis, who maybe hasn't been through the whole hearing, we're just, as a practice, duplicating.
Right, understood. I would assume it's the same excerpts.
Thank you.
Thank you. Attorney Anawici. Attorney Wright. Thank you. EOE. Thank you. Commissioner Karen.
So, Mr. Ellis, earlier you were talking, we were discussing in your rebuttal testimony, figure 5. And I think you were referring to, I don't know how you'd put it, an idea that there's going to be essentially a dismantling of the local distribution gas companies sometime in the future. Consequently, you think your depreciation curve should be steeper, and presuming that's to recover the assets while there's still revenue to collect. Is that essentially, did I get that essentially right?
You have the concept right. To be a little bit careful, I'm not saying that the gas industry is going to be dismantled or anything like that. And in fact, a lot of the analysis I've seen doesn't necessarily anticipate that, nor do I think that's necessarily the most cost-effective way to do this. But most of the analysis I've seen have shown some degree of decline in throughput and decline in the number of customers, both, and especially the latter of which will lead to more retirements. You know, especially if there's things like zonal electrification or things like that, you would retire and dismantle everything associated with that. And so if the future plays out like that, even with kind of a more moderate electrification scenario, not like a big electric, you would see in that figure the retirements pulled forward in time and more of them, and also with kind of that final cost of removal, you would see higher cost of removal as well. So I would expect this graph to kind of move forward in time and be steeper if the future does kind of follow one of
So it's
those.
going toward the left
Yes,
Okay.
and higher.
and going higher.
Exactly.
And in the analyses that you've seen and the studies you've seen, is there a dynamic of regionality that is heat pumps work very well in the south and the warmer climes, but not so well in the higher latitudes? So consequently, there may not be as much penetration, and we're seeing that in terms of electric vehicles, for instance.
So yes, I have seen that. I mean, New York's a state, for example, where I've done some work on this, and you see I think you'll see different things in, say, Plattsburgh than you will see downstate, for example. So yes, that's definitely a dynamic. Now, what it ends up meaning is an interesting question, because you could in colder areas still have a lot of heat pump penetration just with backup gas as a fuel, with gas as a backup fuel source. And that's where I think the units of production is particularly interesting to look at in those scenarios, because you end up with less demand per customer, even if you still have the same number of customers, but you still need to equitably increase depreciation quite a bit, because otherwise you're still going to kind of get that death spiral that I think would make that backup fuel source unaffordable if you don't recover costs faster today.
Right. So you're seeing dual heating systems in homes, much as we see hybrid electric vehicles, dual power systems doing the exact same thing.
I see that as a possibility. I mean, I should say that I think a lot of these analysis they're forward-looking, looking many years in the future, and there's probably some technologies that don't exist yet that'll end up being used by then. But yeah, that's one potential option, particularly for, as you mentioned, the cold weather places where I think full electrification is going to be really challenging, particularly its impact on the electric system.
Right. Okay. All right. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
No questions. Thank you. Do you need a moment to consider redirect?
Thank you. We have no redirect for our panel.
Okay, thank you. Then Mr. Alice, you're excused.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, if I can call up the OCC's depreciation panel for SCG, Attorney Venora, you are up for cross first.
Yeah.
Are you waiving?
I expect to have no cross. I have no cross for the SCG.
Okay,
OCC SCG depreciation witness.
thank you. Then authority staff can approach the cross-examination table, please.
While everyone's getting settled, I'll just say, in case it helps Mr. Garrett, we do intend to ask Mr. Dunkel to stipulate to his prior testimony.
Great, thank you. Then I will remind Mr. Dunkel he remains under oath, and Attorney Talbert's legal if you want to take care of any preliminary matters.
So, Mr. Dunkel, good morning again. Please make sure, yeah.
Good morning.
So did you file initial testimony on February 8th, 2024, sir rebuttal testimony on March 13th, 2024, and various interrogatory responses pertaining to the Southern Connecticut Gas Company in this proceeding?
Yes.
Do you have any corrections or amendments to any of those filings?
No.
Do you adopt those filings as your sworn testimony in this proceeding?
Yes.
Do you recall testifying in this proceeding earlier today and responding to cross-examination from authority staff related to the Connecticut Natural Gas Company?
Yes.
As you appear today to respond to cross-examination as to your testimonies and discovery responses pertaining to Southern Connecticut Gas, do you adopt your in-person testimony from earlier today and stipulate that if asked the same questions again, your answers would be the same with the exception of any numerical figures such as dollars or personnel head count that differ between the two companies?
The answers would be the same, that the dollar amounts or factors might be somewhat different, but the concepts would all be the same, yes.
Okay, thank you. With that, Mr. Dunkel's ready for cross-examination.
Thank you. Mr. Garrett, please.
Hello again, Mr. Dunkel.
Hello?
I think I have some substantially similar questions for you. So you filed different depreciation rates for SCG and CNG
Correct.
in different net salvage rates, different numbers overall.
Yes.
Other than those, the actual numerical, the number differences, is your testimony between the two companies and your approaches substantially the same?
The concepts are the same. The dollar amounts might be different, of course.
Do you think of anything that's different that you'd want to add from our discussion this morning as it relates to the between the two companies, or is it all the same?
No.
Yeah,
Same
I have-
concepts.
I have no further questions.
Okay.
Thank you. Attorney Inoue. Attorney Wright. Yoe. Commissioner Karen.
No questions.
I have no questions. Would you like to consider redirect?
Well, can we get about 20 minutes to consider redirect? No, I don't think we have any redirect. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Dunkel. You are excused. That brings us to the end of our agenda for the evidentiary hearings related to this matter. I will go over a couple of housekeeping matters and then would ask any party with an administrative matter to flag that. So where's Attorney Venora? I have an administrative matter for the company, please. I'm realizing that we did a great job with the late files replicating for CNG and SCG with the exception of the very first late file. So I don't know if this was on your list, but my proposal would be to have late file 1 be the CNG, and then I'm now all the way at the end with 211 and make that the SCG equivalent of late file 1, just so we can have them separate as we did for every other late file.
Can you hear me on this? I don't know if this is.
Would you like to sit down?
Okay, how about now? Can you hear me?
Can you hear?
Okay,
I'm fine.
all right,
Yeah.
okay. Can I have one moment? I just want to check with Mr. Hurwitz, who is taking the lead on
Oh,
developing late file 1. So.
Of course.
We can do either. One of the concepts that we had was, I'll come up to the
Okay.
table. Okay. That's better. One of the thoughts we had was for late file 1 to do similar to the SFRs, how we had a late file 1 CNG or a late file 1 SCG. That was a concept we had, but we are happy to do it either way. So we could have it bookend late file one and
Yeah, I apologize for that, but I think for, since I did it that way for every other one, it would be helpful for me if we could just bookend it as 211. So the SCG version of late file one will become, bless you, 211.
okay.
And so the late file exhibits from today and yesterday are due May 17th by 4 PM. There were a handful of late files noted today, last week, and the first week that also received the due date of May 17th at 4 PM. If anyone needs me to refresh their recollection about that, I can, but I think the record should be clear on that. And my only other housekeeping note is to make sure that folks noticed that the late file hearings start at 9 AM. So the Wednesday, May 22nd, we would see everyone here at 9 AM. Are there any other administrative matters from any party or intervener before we regroup at the late file hearings?
Chair Gillette and Commissioners, I have just one. It relates to a motion for administrative notice that the companies will be filing within the next day or so. And we are not asking for a ruling today, but I just wanted to provide some background on why we're submitting this particular motion. It relates to testimony that was provided by Mr. Langland at the hearing on April 29th. This is the date on which he was being cross-examined as part of the CNG Capital Investment Panel. Mr. Langland was asked some questions about the utility's obligation to serve and the customer's right to utility service. And in responding to those questions, Mr. Langland referred to information on Puro's website, which was a webpage entitled Your Utility Service Rights and Responsibilities. During his testimony, he read from portions of that webpage and specifically a subsection on that page entitled Customer Rights and Responsibilities. And the exchange is on pages 819 to 821 of the CNG transcript. After the testimony, on April 30th, we identified that the webpage Mr. Langland had referenced had been changed to remove the subsection on customer rights and responsibility, which is the subsection he was reading from. In light of this, the company's motion for administrative notice will ask Pura to take administrative notice for the record of 2 screenshots of the webpage. We will provide copies of them with our motion. The first screenshot is the webpage as it appeared at the time of Mr. Langland's testimony, taken at, the screenshot was taken on April 30th at approximately 11:30 a.m., but it will show on the footer that it's the page that was active on the website last updated in May 2022. So it is the version that he was reading from. And then the second screenshot that we will submit is the webpage as it appeared shortly after that on April 30th at approximately 12:30, showing that the page had been changed to remove the customer rights and responsibilities subsection. The footer on that page shows it was last updated in April 2024. So in summary, with that background, we will submit the motion for Pura's review and consideration within the next couple of days. And that's the only other matter that I had for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other party or intervener with matter? Okay, then we are adjourned and we will see everyone on May 22nd. Thanks.
Thank you.
No, see you. Are you gonna be out in Oklahoma? Yeah. I know. I know.